Right. I'm angry. I was angry last night, and I was reading this last night and on Twitter about what I'm about to mention, and I was absolutely fucking livid at this. Amongst other things that Liz Truss has done since we've come back from the recess of Parliament due to the Queen dying, and I've got something to say about that as well at a later date. This isn't the video for that. So, what did Liz Truss do after she came back from the recess? What was her first priority to take care of? Well, it wasn't the energy crisis that's taking place in this country. It wasn't the cost. It wasn't the cost of lockdown crisis in this country. It wasn't even to restore law and order in Leicestershire, a town that has been split apart by a ethnic civil war between Muslims and Hindus, who are basically having pitched battles on the streets, and there are Muslims flooding in from other towns and cities into Leicestershire to reinforce these gangs that are walking the streets, hunting down Hindus and causing them harm. No, it wasn't to address that or restore law and order. No, it was to come out publicly and say that she was reaffirming support for Ukraine and the fact that we're giving them a further 2.5 billion in arms, in an arms package for the Ukraine. That's where her priorities lay. Not the people of this country, Ukraine. Why is that? I don't know. Maybe you can answer it. But I'm going to tell you a few little home truths about the Ukraine and the UK's involvement in that conflict. So, the US, basically NATO wanted to provoke Russia into a war. So what the UK and the US did was they organised a coup in Ukraine where they removed the democratically elected president of the time. They removed him and they installed the NATO puppet Zelensky, the NATO-friendly Zelensky, somebody they could control and influence in Ukraine. So they just let him run riot in Ukraine. Now, there were treaties with certain parts of Ukraine, mainly the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, Donbass and other parts, mainly Donbass. So what happened was, as soon as Zelensky got in charge, he started shelling Donbass, this Russian area of the Ukraine. He started shelling it, and there was a genocide. 15,000 civilians were killed due to Zelensky. And you haven't heard a peep about this on the news because the news in this country is controlled. It's controlled by the very people, the globalists, that are doing the things in Ukraine, and they don't want you to know about it. So we're at fault. We provoked Russia into this action, and this is exactly what NATO wanted. They wanted this. Don't have any doubts about that whatsoever. And let's have a look at Zelensky and what he's doing in the Ukraine. So this hasn't been mentioned before, and don't get me wrong, I'm not pro-Russia or anything like that. There are no good guys in this conflict, Zelensky or Putin. They're both bad guys. Their countries are both heavily corrupt beyond belief. So it beggars belief why we're having anything to do with the Ukraine in this situation. We heard Boris Johnson mouthing off about how we had to protect the sovereign nation and democracy in Ukraine. The Ukraine isn't a democracy. Zelensky had the opposition party arrested. He shut down news channels. He shut down free speech in Ukraine. You don't hear about this, of course, because obviously, like I said before, the mainstream media that feeds you your information is controlled by the globalists that are pushing this agenda. And basically what we have in Ukraine is a huge money laundering situation where we give them billions in aid and it gets taken away from the people, from us, where the taxpayer, our money is being stolen from us, given into the Ukraine where it's laundered and it comes back in other ways to the people in power. Our money is being stolen. That's what's happening. That's the whole reason for the Ukraine. Well, why would we give two shits about a corrupt country like Ukraine? We don't usually. There's plenty more conflicts going on in the world that are where people are dying by the thousands, but we don't seem to give a shit about those conflicts, do we? We're not giving billions in aid to certain factions in those conflicts. No, because the whole situation in the Ukraine was organised. It was organised as a way for NATO to fight a proxy war with Russia. That's what it's all about. NATO is the aggressor in this situation. It's constantly expanding its influence in the area, and quite rightly so. Russia is getting nervous about that. We would. If Russia started to expand its borders and pushing up against NATO countries, they would be reacting the same way Russia is reacting now, wouldn't they? Of course they would. And nobody ever says anything about the UK or the US when we go and invade countries and get involved in conflicts, do they? Iraq, Afghanistan. We didn't exactly improve conditions in those countries, do we? And I know firsthand, because I've been to those countries. I know what chaos was left behind after the troops pulled out. So I know firsthand that we didn't help those countries. But nobody ever says anything about that. We left those countries worse off than when we entered those countries. There's no doubts about that whatsoever. So we have Liz Truss now wanting to join the European community. She's considering joining the European community, which is basically rejoining the EU via the back door. And anybody who expected the leopard to change its spots was naive. Liz Truss is a Liberal Democrat Remainer. That's what she is at her core. She isn't a hard right conservative. She's never been a hard right conservative. She's a W.E.F puppet, just like Sunak was. He was a W.E.F puppet. The W.F edged its bets. It had two candidates in the race to be Prime Minister of this country. They couldn't allow an underdog or an outlier to take that position because they might not do what the W.E.F wants them to do. So I had no doubts in my mind that we were just going to get more of the same from the Conservative Party. And we would just get more of the same if this had been Labour as well. The only difference between Labour and the Conservative Party in this situation is that Labour would have got to this position a lot faster and we would still be in lockdown. I've got no doubts about that. That's the only difference between Labour and the Conservative Party, is that the timeline was slowed down with the Conservatives, whereas the Labour would have pushed it further and faster. We've got the same result. People were talking about how if Corbyn got in power, our country would be destroyed. Our country has been destroyed. That's already happened, just at a slower rate. Corbyn would have done it faster. That's the only difference, unfortunately. So, where are we now? We're in a real mess. We've got uncontrolled illegal immigration. We've got a cost of lockdown crisis that our government isn't tackling. Not tackling any of these issues. They're more concerned with issues abroad than they are with their own people in this country. And what do we do about that? You have to start asking yourself, what do we do about that? We demand a general election. I'm not saying that it's going to do any good. I've got no faith in the voting system, but at least it's a choice that we have, isn't it? And people are going to have to change their voting habits in this situation. You can't vote for Labour. You can't vote for Conservatives. You can't vote for any of the mainstream parties that are in Parliament at the minute. The whole lot, the whole political class that's presently in Parliament needs to be wiped clean and start from afresh with new blood in there. So whatever you do, you have to vote for a party that can get into power. So the next general election, I'm going to be voting for the Reform Party. That's who I'm voting for. I don't necessarily agree with everything that they say, but at least it's an independent party and it's fresh blood, and we'll see what they do with the situation. We can't keep voting for the same old, tired agenda that we keep getting from the Tories and Labour Party, can we? We know that by now. We're just getting more of the same. They promise us they're going to tackle the issues that are important to us, and in the end, they deliver nothing. It's just talk. Always talk, no action. This is Vindicator. Sign off.